Before we begin, I need you to understand one thing. This is not a story about drug use. It is about a plant older than human civilization. How it became the pretext for a war that reshaped entire societies, destroyed millions of lives, and altered the very foundations of global law and order. So if you're here for this journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely wish to delve deeper. Tell me in the comments where you're from, and what time it is where you are right now. The world is vast, and this story touches every corner of it. Put your phone away, shut out distractions. Now let us begin. In the beginning, there was only hemp. Not hemp flowers, not weed, not cannabis, just hemp. This all-fiber plant with serrated leaves, and thrives in nearly every human minus inhabited region. Its origins lie shrouded in ancient mists, perhaps emerging from Central Asia, possibly present minus day Mongolia or the Tibetan Plateau. Archaeological evidence suggests the partnership between humans and hemp has endured for at least 10,000 years, if not longer. This was no union born of intoxication, but a necessity for survival. Neolithic ancestors, and began cultivating the land, soon discovered this plant to be a gift from the heavens. Its fibers rank among nature's most resilient materials, stripped from the stalk, dried, and twisted into cordage. Hemp rope could bear immense loads without breaking, woven into cloth. It offered durability, breathability, and resistance to decay. In an era where survival depended on ingenuity and resources demanded utmost utilization, hemp proved indispensable. It clothed the body, became the sail that rode the wave, and served as the very thread binding civilization together. By 8000 BC, hemp cultivation had spread across Asia. In ancient China, though not a grain, it was counted among the 5 grains. The Chinese utilized every part of the plant. Seeds were pressed for oil, providing a rich nutritional source. Fibers were spun into clothing and paper. Indeed, paper. The oldest surviving paper fragments, dating back to the 2nd century BC, were crafted from hemp fibers. As one of the world's earliest comprehensive medical texts, the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica listed cannabis as a panacea for rheumatism, malaria, and even for good fensels. The legendary Emperor Shen Nong, father of Chinese agriculture and medicine, is said to have employed it as early as 2737 BC to treat ailments like gout. Whether historical fact or mythical wisdom, this attests to cannabis's profound roots in the ancient world. It served not only as medicine and material, but also became a gateway to altered states of consciousness. The ancient Scythians understood this well. These formidable nomadic horsemen struck terror across the vast steppes from the Black Sea to China's borders. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus, with the precision of an anthropologist, documented their ritualistic cannabis practices. Following funerals, he wrote, the Scythians would erect small tents and place burning stones within. Hemp seeds were then scattered over them, the tents filled with an intense fragrance. Mourners would inhale deeply, emitting cries of delight. This was a ritual of release and transcendence, a pathway to the spirit world, and the veneration of the departed. This was not recreational use in the modern sense, but a sacred sacrament. As trade routes expanded, and empires rose and fell, when vast caravans migrated along the Silk Road, cannabis journeyed with them. Upon reaching India, it found its spiritual home within Hindu tradition. Cannabis is intimately linked to Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation. Legend holds that Shiva himself consumes bhang, a beverage made by grinding cannabis leaves and mixing them with milk, spices, and honey. It is said to bring clarity of mind, aid meditation, and open the doors of perception. Bhang is widely consumed during festivals, particularly the colorful Holi festival. To this day, it remains legal and widely used in India. In the form of bhang, ganja, and hashish, cannabis has woven itself into the religious and cultural fabric of the subcontinent. It is the plant of aesthetics, and the plant of Himalayan yogis seeking enlightenment. From India, cannabis spread to the Middle East and Africa. In the ancient world, cannabis was ubiquitous. a silent companion as the curtain of human civilization slowly rose. Yet, in Western Europe, its story unfolded quite differently. The Greeks and Romans certainly knew of cannabis, using its fibers for ropes and textiles. But the psychopative properties of cannabis, the concept of altering consciousness through inhalation or ingestion, did not take root in European culture, at least not then. For them, cannabis was a crop, not a sacred substance, a utilitarian object, not a mystical one. For millennia, this equilibrium persisted. Cannabis existed in dozens of forms across dozens of cultures. Each people utilized it according to their own needs and beliefs. In China, it was medicine. In Rome, rope. In India, a sacred intoxicant. In Scythia, a mourning ritual. It was ubiquitous yet unremarkable, part of the human agricultural landscape. No one feared it. No one demonized it. It was simply an ordinary plant, like countless other herbs and trees, quietly serving its purpose. Then the world changed. The age of exploration dawned. Hemp reached unprecedented heights of utility, yet sowed the seeds of future persecution. Those great sailing ships that carried European empires across the oceans to conquer the New World were built from hemp fiber. Every rope, every sail, every piece of rigging and caulking material came from it. A single large warship required over 50 tons of hemp rope. Without hemp rope, there would have been no age of exploration, no global empires, no Columbian exchange. Hemp rope held strategic significance, its importance to national security rivaling that of steel and gunpowder. It was truly an indispensable strategic resource for the Navy. When European colonizers reached the New World, their foremost task was to cultivate hemp. In 1606, French botanist Louis Harbor sowed North America's first hemp field in present Minestay, Nova Scotia. 1611, the English followed suit in Virginia. Colonial authorities not only encouraged hemp cultivation, but mandated it as a compulsory industry. Virginia law stipulated that every farmer must grow hemp, with offenders facing fines or imprisonment. George Washington cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson cultivated hemp at Monticello. Benjamin Franklin's paper mill operated using hemp as raw material. The first draft of the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. This was by no means a countercultural crop. Rather, it was an established mainstream crop, and a cornerstone of the colonial economy. Hemp was money. Its value was so high that in certain colonies, it could even be used to pay taxes. It was literally woven into the fabric of the emerging American Republic. The canvas for wagons pushing westward, the rope for laying railways. Levi Strauss made the first pair of jeans from hemp fiber, durable enough to withstand the grueling trials of gold miners. But here the story diverges. A single plant began leading a dual existence. Industrial hemp, fiber, seeds, paper stock, cultivated varieties of cannabis sativa, bred over generations, to enhance stem strength and reduce psychopative compounds. These plants grew tall, rich in fiber, with negligible levels of tetrafosphorinorginable THC, the chemical responsible for cannabis's intoxicating effects. Smoked, industrial hemp would merely induce excruciating headaches, yet in the warm climates of India, Mexico, the Caribbean and parts of Africa, distinct varieties persisted. Indian cannabis and certain alfalfa strains were cultivated for their inflorescences. These resin-rich buds contained THC concentrations vastly exceeding those of industrial hemp. They were not rope-making material, but hallucinogenic drugs. As global trade and population movements accelerated from the 19th to early 20th centuries, the worlds of industrial hemp and psychedelic cannabis began to collide within Western consciousness. This collision progressed slowly at first. During the 1830s and 1840s, European colonial physicians stationed in India began documenting cannabis's medicinal properties. Irish physician William Brooke S. Herridge conducted extensive research in Calcutta and published his findings in 1839. He reported that cannabis tincture demonstrated remarkable efficacy in treating muscular spasms, rheumatism, and convulsions. Upon returning samples to Britain, cannabis extracts were swiftly prescribed across Europe and America. By the 1850s, cannabis had been included in the United States Pharmacopoeia, this officially recognized compendium of medicines, whereupon members of the public could freely purchase cannabis tinctures, extracts and pills, indicated for conditions ranging from migraines and menstrual cramps to insomnia. Pharmaceutical companies such as Parker Davis, Lilly, and Squibb all manufactured cannabis-based medicines. At that time, there was neither stigmatization nor moral panic. It was simply one of many herbal preparations considered routine medicine. But cannabis's entry into Western society extended beyond this. In the 1840s, a group of French Romantic writers and artists formed an organization in Paris known as the Club des Esquires, whose members included literary giants such as Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, and Victor Hugo. They would gather at a hotel on the Ile Saint-Louis, consuming thick green cannabis paste mixed with honey, immersing themselves all night in drug-induced altered states of consciousness. Baudelaire meticulously documented the experience, describing how the drug distorted perceptions of time, amplified sensory experiences, and unlocked creative hallucinations. He also cautioned against its dangers. The drug could lure users into passive dream states, gradually eroding their willpower. At this stage, cannabis was an exotic intellectual curiosity. It carried a bohemian air of rebellion, tinged with Oriental's hues. Though the Western world was captivated, it remained perpetually marginalist, a plaything for artists and adventurers. The common folk showed no interest in consuming cannabis resin. They had tinctures, which sufficed. Then came the great waves of immigration, accompanied by a tide of demonition. From the late 19th to the early 20th century, a wave of immigrants swept across America. Mexican laborers fled the chaos and violence of the Mexican Revolution erupting in 1910, bringing their language, culture and customs, among which was the practice of cannabis consumption, known in Spanish as marijuana, particularly prevalent among Mexico's working classes, especially soldiers and laborers, used both for recreational purposes and medicinal applications. After arduous labor, it offered an affordable and readily available means of relaxation. Mexican immigrants settled predominantly in the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona and California, engaging in agricultural, railway and mining work. Yet the cannabis they brought almost immediately became a fuse for racial and economic anxieties. Here the narrative takes a darker turn. This plant became weapon, is aired within a broader culture war. The very term marijuana carries profound significance. Americans had decades of medical cannabis usage history, yet marijuana was a foreign word, a Mexican term. Anti-cannabis campaigners deliberately employed this term to make the drug seem alien and dangerous, linking it to immigrant communities. White Americans, meanwhile, harbored widespread suspicion and hostility towards immigrants. Local newspapers, particularly those in Texas, began publishing sensationalist accounts of Mexicans committing crimes after smoking cannabis. The drug was blamed for violence, insanity and moral decay, serving as a convenient scapegoat, channeling broad anti-immigrant sentiment into specific legislative targets. 1914 El Paso became one of America's first cities to ban the sale and possession of cannabis. The motive was transparent. The city council sought to control the growing Mexican population by outlawing their customary drug, thus providing the police with a means to act. This pattern repeated itself across the Southwest. By the 1920s, over a dozen states had passed anti-cannabis legislation. The vast majority of these states had substantial Mexican immigrant populations. Thus began the drug war. Yet at this stage, it remained confined to the local level. Actions were fragmented and inextricably linked to xenophobic sentiment. Meanwhile, another cultural revolution was brewing in the northern urban centers. As part of the Great Migration, African Americans moving from rural southern states brought with them the culture of jazz. In New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, and Harlem smoke-filled underground clubs. Jazz musicians discovered cannabis enhanced musical expression. It slowed the passage of time, heightened sensory perception, elevating improvisation to transcendent realms. Louis Armstrong used cannabis throughout his life, calling it his regulator, believing it relaxed mind and body, allowing music to flow naturally. Cab Calloway playfully alluded to the drug in his 1932 song The Marijuana Man. Yet what the black jazz community celebrated, instilled fear in white America. Jazz itself was deemed dangerous, primitive and sexually provocative. Marijuana thus became associated with this threat. It represented black music, black culture, black subversion. This drug was no longer merely a Mexican problem. It had become a black problem. This racial dimension could not be ignored. The core of the anti-marijuana movement was never public health or pharmacology. It was about control. Its target was groups deemed dangerous, unwelcome, or politically inconvenient by the establishment. Drugs were merely the excuse. Suppression was the ultimate goal. Amidst this turbulent landscape, a man emerged who would dominate American drug policy for decades. Harry Anslinger. 1930 Harry Jake Anslinger was appointed as the inaugural commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a position he held until 1962. He was both a bureaucrat and a moral crusader, as well as a master propagandist. His career was dedicated to a singular mission, the eradication of cannabis. In the early years of his tenure, Anslinger actually paid little attention to cannabis. His focus remained firmly fixed on opiates and cocaine, substances subject to federal regulations since the enactment of the Harrison Act in 1914. However, as the Great Depression deepened, the Bureau of Narcotics faced imminent budget cuts, and S.C.H. Linger urgently required a new holy war to justify the agency's continued existence. Cannabis, which remained largely unregulated at federal level at that time, presented a perfect opportunity. Anslinger launched a relentless and duplicitous media offensive, cultivating relationships with newspaper editors and feeding them sensationalist tales designed to terrify the public. His propaganda heavily drew upon racist narratives, circulating in the southwest and northern urban centers. He claimed cannabis rendered users violent, psychotic, unstable, and sexually deviant. During congressional testimony, he cited horrifying case studies of adult men murdering with axes after cannabis use, and raping white women. One of his most frequently cited cases was the 1933 Florida incident, where Euphictor Cotter axed his family to death. Anslinger insisted cannabis was the root cause, despite Cotter's documented history of severe mental illness, and no evidence he had ever consumed cannabis. The truth was irrelevant. The narrative served its purpose. Anslinger's rhetoric was steeped in venomous racism. In private correspondence and public testimony, he spoke of cannabis minus mad blacks, warned cannabis would induce white women to engage in sexual relations with blacks and black entertainers. He amassed and disseminated a dossier, a sensationalist report, exaggerating cannabis minus related crimes, most unverified or entirely fabricated. He understood that fear, particularly racial fear, was the most potent tool for shaping public opinion. Hollywood eagerly capitalized on this panic, producing exploitative films, reinforcing Anslinger's narrative. Most notoriously, 1930's Sesame, One of Madness, originally titled Tell Your Children, portrayed cannabis as a 1-way ticket to insanity, violence, and death. In the film, while misbehaved youths were lured to marijuana parties, and within minutes succumbed to hallucinations, madly playing the piano, laughing hysterically, causing fatal car accidents, ultimately leading to suicide and mental collapse. Such absurdly exaggerated propaganda, the films were widely distributed to schools and churches as educational material. This propaganda campaign proved effective. By 1937, Anslinger had amassed sufficient political momentum to push for federal legislation, ultimately resulting in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Strictly speaking, the act did not directly criminalize cannabis, but imposed exorbitant taxes on cultivation, prescription, or sale. It mandated registration, special order forms, and steep fees, rendering compliance nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. This constituted a bureaucratic prohibition. At congressional hearings, Dr. William Woodward, representing the American Medical Association, testified against the bill. He asserted cannabis had legitimate medical uses. There was no scientific evidence to substantiate Anslinger's claims of violence and insanity. He further exposed the term cannabis as deliberately misleading. This terminology obscured the medical essence of decades of prescription practice. His testimony was disregarded. Industrial hemp growers also voiced objections. They argued hemp cultivation was vital for rope, textile and paper industries. Yet at this time, firms like DuPont were developing synthetic fibers, such as nylon. Wood pulp had become the primary raw material for paper production. Some historians contend, though this remains contentious, that corporate interests within these industries covertly backed prohibition to eliminate competitors. Whether conspiracy or coincidence, the outcome proved identical. Despite its industrial value, cannabis became entangled in the vortex of prohibition. The Cannabis Act passed with almost no opposition. Few members of Congress understood what they were voting on. Even fewer cared about the substance. The bill was packaged as legislation to control dangerous drugs used on Mexicans and black people. That was sufficient. And so, this plant, cultivated by humans for millennia, which had clothed armies, nourished the populace, and healed the sick, became an illicit substance. Almost overnight, the war was declared. The enemy was named. For 80 years thereafter, this conflict escalated, spread, engulfing society. Yet this plant proved tenacious and resilient, refusing to vanish. World War I forced a temporary truce in the cannabis war, when Japanese invasion of the Philippines severed U.S. military supplies of Manila hemp, actually a different plant. The U.S. forces faced crisis. This hemp was essential for ropes, rigging, and parachute webbing. Its shortage threatened the war effort. The government displayed astonishing cognitive dissonance and promptly reversed policy. In 1942, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched the Victory Hemp campaign, producing propaganda films urging farmers to cultivate hemp as a patriotic duty. Hemp growers were exempted from military service. Midwestern cultivation surged beyond 400,000 acres. A plant demonized just 5 years prior instantly became a hero. Yet the moment the war ended, tolerance vanished. Hemp fields were plowed under and destroyed. The program was utterly buried. The government even denied the film Victory Hemp remained lost for decades, until surviving copies were discovered in the Library of Congress and National Archive. Cannabis prohibition resumed as if uninterrupted. Throughout the post-war years, cannabis remained marginal in mainstream American society, associated only with jazz musicians, Mexican laborers and bohemian fringe groups. The 1950 Second Beat generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, embraced it as a symbol of resistance against a conformist society, yet they remained outliers among cultural rebels, with limited influence, until the 1960 seconds, when everything changed abruptly. This counterculture movement wore many faces: youth rebellion, sexual liberation, anti-ness, authoritarian struggle, but it was undeniably also a drug culture. Cannabis spread from jazz clubs and beat poetry readings to university campuses, permeated suburban bedrooms, and ultimately engulfed the entire nation. Youth rebellion, sexual liberation, anti-minus authoritarianism. Yet it was undeniably also emblematic of drug culture. Cannabis became its spiritual totem, spreading from jazz clubs and beat poetry readings to university campuses, penetrated suburban bedrooms, ultimately engulfing an entire era. That generation questioned everything their parents had instilled. Cannabis became a symbol. Smoking it signified open opposition to the Vietnam War, opposition to racism, opposition to the suffocating social homogeneity of 1950s America. It was a political manifesto wrapped in cigarette paper. Hippies on San Francisco's Ashbury Street, protesters at Kent State University, the crowds at Woodstock. Music, idealism and cannabis became inextricably linked. Establishment figures were deeply alarmed. Cannabis was once again associated with groups threatening social order, this time not Mexicans or black jazz musicians, but white middle-class children, the offspring of respectable families choosing to drop out, immerse themselves, light up. Parents were thrown into a panic. politicians sensed an opportunity. Richard Nixon, running for president in 1968, made law and order the cornerstone of his campaign. For him and his advisors, the counterculture was not merely a cultural movement, but a political enemy. This now infamous remark, revealed by Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Eric Mann in a 1994 interview, made clear that in 1968, Nixon's campaign team and subsequent White House administration had two primary adversaries, the anti-war left and African Americans. We knew we couldn't outlaw anti-war sentiment or black identity, but by linking hippies with marijuana and African Americans with heroin, then imposing harsh criminal penalties on both, we could dismantle these groups. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, disrupt their gatherings, and demonize them night after night on the evening news. Were we aware the drug charges were false? Of course we were. This is no conspiracy theory, but a documented strategy. Nixon initiated the war on drugs, continued by successive administrations. Its core has never been the drugs themselves. It concerns control. It concerns suppressing dissent. It concerns striking at groups challenging the political status quo. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, classifying drugs into 5 schedules based on medical value and abuse potential. Cannabis was placed in the most restrictive Schedule I, defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, alongside heroin and LSD, while cocaine and methamphetamine were placed in Schedule II. This classification had no scientific basis. The Schaefer Commission, personally appointed by Nixon, spent 2 years studying cannabis. In 1972, it concluded that cannabis should be decriminalized. Nixon ignored the report and shelved it. The law enforcement apparatus rapidly expanded. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established to consolidate federal drug enforcement powers. State and local police forces received federal funding and military-grade equipment to wage the war on drugs. Mandatory minimum sentencing stripped judges of their discretion, resulting in even minor cannabis offenses potentially carrying years of imprisonment. Subsequently, millions of arrests commenced. The figures are staggering. Between 1965 and 2020, over 26 million Americans were arrested on cannabis charges. 20-6 million. This number exceeds Australia's entire population. Approximately 88% of those arrested were detained solely for possession, not trafficking. They were predominantly users, often young people, often arrested for possessing small quantities for personal use. Racial disparities are equally stark. Despite similar usage rates across ethnic groups, studies consistently show white and black individuals have comparable cannabis consumption rates. Yet black individuals are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than their white counterparts. In certain states, this disparity is even more pronounced. In Montana, black individuals face nearly 10 times the arrest rate for cannabis compared to whites, despite comprising less than 1% of the state's population. This is no coincidence, but a consequence of policy. The war on drugs has provided law enforcement with tools and justifications to exert high-pressure control over minority communities. Stop-and search policies, broken windows policing, no-knock search warrants, all gain legitimacy under the banner of drug interdiction. Cannabis becomes the most readily available trophy, the simplest basis for charges, and the most expedient route to feed the ever-expanding prison-industrial complex. For this is precisely the industry taking shape. Private prisons emerged in the 1980s. These corporations profit by contracting with state governments to incarcerate prisoners. Their business model relies on high incarceration rates. Marijuana arrests provide a constant supply of inventory. The consequences for those arrested are catastrophic and lifelong. Even for minor possession of marijuana, conviction means imprisonment, but the punishment extends far beyond that. It means a permanent criminal record appearing on every job application, every housing application, every background check. It means losing eligibility for federal student loans, public housing, food stamps. It means professional licenses being revoked. In many states, loss of voting rights, loss of parental custody and entanglement in custody battles. A single joint is enough to shatter an entire life. Families torn asunder, communities hollowed out. During the peak of the cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and 90s, when mass incarceration reached its zenith, an entire generation of Black and Latino men were thrust into the criminal justice system. Community bonds were severed. Children grew up in fatherless households. The stigma of incarceration fueled decades-long cycles of poverty and crime. Meanwhile, cannabis use continued to rise. This is the fundamental failure of prohibition. Prohibition does not work. It never has. Prohibition in the 1920s did not stop people drinking. Instead, it spawned a vast black market, nurtured organized crime, and late 2000s dying from adulterated moonshine. The cannabis prohibition followed the same pattern. By the 1970s and 80s, cannabis cultivation had become a major industry in the United States. Domestic growers, particularly in California's Emerald Triangle, Humboldt County, Mendocino County and Trinity County, produced high-minus cannabis that rivaled Mexican and Colombian imports. Remote, densely forested mountain ranges provided ideal cover. Growers carved out hidden plots deep within national forests, far from roads and prying eyes. The government responded with force. In 1983, California launched Operation Cleanup. Helicopter raids became routine. Heavily armed officers frequently stormed rural plots without warrants, seizing plants and arresting growers. These paramilitary operations, equipped with automatic weapons, bulletproof vests and night-vision gear, never stemmed the tide of cultivation. For every plot destroyed, 10 times the number sprang up the following season. The economic law proved overwhelming. A single mature cannabis plant could fetch $1,000 to $3,000 on the black market. For struggling rural communities, for those unemployed by the collapse of the timber industry, cannabis cultivation became the sole livelihood. The irony was bitterly cruel. The very prohibition intended to eradicate cannabis instead created the perfect breeding ground for its rampant proliferation. In the absence of legal regulation, there was no quantity control, nor age restrictions, nor tax collection. The entire market is controlled by criminal syndicates. These criminals have become fabulously wealthy. In Mexico, cannabis cultivation once lagged far behind opium copy cultivation and cocaine transit operations. But in the 1980s, as Colombian drug cartels shifted focus to cocaine, and the US government pressured Mexico to eradicate poppy fields, marijuana cultivation exploded. Cartels such as Sinaloa, Gulf and Juarez established vast marijuana plantations in the Sierra Madre Mountains. These were not small, scale operations hidden in jungles, but industrialized enterprises. Thousands of cannabis plants covered hillsides, irrigated and tended by armed herdsmen. The cartels drew upon lessons from the cocaine trade. Vertical integration proved pivotal to maximizing profits. They controlled the entire supply chain, from cultivation through smuggling to distribution in American cities. The violent tactics of the cocaine wars now permeated the cannabis trade. Rival groups engaged in bloody turf wars over the smuggling routes. Farmers who refused to cultivate cannabis or attempted to switch allegiances faced brutal elimination. Local police officers and officials were either bribed or assassinated. By the 2000s, vast swaths of Mexico had become lawless territories, where drug lords, armed gangs, overwhelming the government with firepower, ran rampant. This humanitarian catastrophe wrought devastating consequences. Between 2006 and 2020, Mexico's drug war claimed over 300,000 lives. Tens of thousands more were reported missing, their remains either buried in mass graves or dissolved in acid. Journalists exposing drug cartels were brutally murdered. Politicians opposing the cartels were gunned down in broad daylight. The wave of violence spilled across borders. Cartels established distribution networks in major U.S. cities. Yet the root cause of this violence, this death and suffering, lies in a plan that half of U.S. states would eventually legalize. For while the drug war raged, a remarkable transformation unfolded at grassroots level. People began to resist. Counterculture never truly died out, but merely went underground. Throughout the 70 seconds, 80 seconds, and 90 seconds, activists persistently worked to reshape public discourse on cannabis. Organizations like NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, actively pushed for decriminalization. High Times magazine, founded in 1974, celebrated cannabis culture, providing a platform for the legalization discourse. The scientific community likewise challenged propaganda narrative. Research on the endocannabinoid system, the network of receptors in the human body that interact with cannabinoids, revealed cannabis poses far fewer harms than alcohol or tobacco. Studies confirmed cannabis is not a gateway drug, does not incite violent behavior, and holds legitimate medical value in treating chronic pain, epilepsy, and chemotherapy side effects. Yet the true breakthrough did not originate from scientists or activists, but emerged from the patient community. During the 1980 seconds, as the AIDS epidemic ravaged the gay community, particularly in San Francisco, patients discovered cannabis alleviated suffering. It stimulated appetite in patients emaciated by the disease, alleviated severe nausea induced by early AIDS medications, relieved chronic neuropathic pain, and for many, it meant being able to eat, live normally, maintain basic quality of life, rather than endure agonizing suffering. It alleviated severe nausea triggered by early HIV drugs, reduced chronic neuropathic pain for numerous patients. This represented a turning point from being unable to eat, losing the capacity for daily living, to a turning point where they could sustain basic survival. Activist Dennis Perlin, himself HIV-positive, founded the San Francisco Marijuana Purchasers Club in 1992. This became America's first openly operating dispensary, though its operations remained illegal at the time. Perlin and his partner provided cannabis to AIDS patients. Local authorities, recognizing its humanitarian significance, largely turned a blind eye. This sowed the seeds of the medical cannabis movement. Plant drafted the Compassionate Use Act Proposition 215 and placed it on California's 1996 ballot. This legislation permitted patients with physician recommendations to legally use medical cannabis, directly challenging federal prohibition. The establishment mounted fierce countermeasures. The Drug Enforcement Administration threatened to arrest doctors prescribing cannabis, while the Clinton administration warned that federal law superseded state statute. Opponents ran advertisements claiming Proposition 215 was a backdoor to full cannabis legalization that would lead to cannabis shops on every street corner. The latter prediction ultimately came true. On election night in November 1996, Proposition 215 passed with 56% of the vote, making California the first state to legalize medical cannabis. The floodgates had opened within mere years. Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Maine and other states followed suit. By 2010, 15 states nationwide had enacted medical cannabis regulations. By 2020, this figure had risen to 30-6 states plus the District of Columbia. Even within this legal gray area, where state laws permitted but federal law prohibited, the medical cannabis industry generated billions in revenue. Yet despite its therapeutic value, medical cannabis clearly served as a stepping stone. California's dispensary system soon became a front for recreational users to obtain cannabis. Securing a medical recommendation proved alarmingly easy. Enter a clinic, undergo a 5-minute consultation, and obtain one. The true decisive battle targeted full legalization. This campaign commenced in 2012 in Colorado and Washington state. The legalization campaigns in both states were meticulously planned, with substantial funding and sophisticated strategy. Activists learned from decades of failure that appeals to individual liberty or countercultural rebellion alone would not prevail. A pragmatic argument was essential. Their message was simple and powerful. Prohibition has failed. It has cost billions of dollars and ruined millions of lives without stopping anyone from using cannabis. Legalization means regulation, taxation and control. It means reclaiming the market from drug cartels, placing it in the hands of licensed, regulated businesses. It means ending arrests and incarceration for non-violent users. It means treating cannabis like alcohol, legal adult use, safety regulation, tax revenue for public benefit. 6 November 2012. Voters in Colorado and Washington state passed ballot initiatives permitting recreational cannabis use for adults aged 21 and over. This historic moment marked the world's first full legalization of cannabis achieved through democratic vote. The federal government's response remained uncertain. Technically speaking, cannabis remained a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, with no recognized medical use. The Drug Enforcement Administration could have cracked down hard, raiding dispensaries, arresting growers and sellers. Yet the Obama administration, sensing the political tide, chose another path. In 2013, the Department of Justice issued the Cole Memorandum, effectively stating that as long as states maintain strict oversight, preventing interstate movement of cannabis or its availability to minors, the federal government would not interfere with state legalization efforts. This move opened the floodgates. Alaska and Oregon legalized in 2014. California followed in 2016. Nevada, Maine and Massachusetts followed suit. In 2018, Canada achieved nationwide legalization, becoming the first major industrialized nation to do so. By 2025, over half of U.S. states had legalized recreational cannabis, with 2-3 permitting medical use. The legal cannabis industry rapidly expanded into a multi-billion-dollar sector, comprising pharmacies, cultivation facilities, processing laboratories, food manufacturers, vaping companies, testing laboratories, security firms, software companies, packaging manufacturers. An entire industrial ecosystem emerged. By 2020, legal cannabis sales in the U.S. surpassed $17 billion, soaring to over $30 billion by 2023. Wall Street took notice. Publicly listed cannabis enterprises landed on major stock exchanges. Venture capital poured in. Celebrities launched their own brands. Snoop Dogg, Willie Nelson, Mike Tyson, and Whoopi Goldberg all transitioned into cannabis entrepreneurs. This plant, demonized for a century, is now being embraced by capitalism. Yet despite the promising prospects of legalization, it is accompanied by complex contradictions and failed cases. The primary issue lies in the suspended status of federal law. Under federal legislation, cannabis remains illegal, classified as a Schedule I substance, deemed to have no medical use, despite substantial scientific evidence to the contrary, and legal markets existing in over half the country. This creates a surreal legal environment. Even in fully legal states, cannabis businesses cannot access the federal banking system. Banks, fearing federal prosecution or loss of FDIC insurance eligibility, refuse to work with cannabis enterprises, resulting in the industry operating primarily on cash. Cannabis dispensaries handle thousands, or even millions, in cash monthly. They must pay taxes in cash, pay staff wages, settle supplier invoices, making them prime targets for robbery, and creating immense logistical and accounting challenges. Meanwhile, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service penalizes cannabis businesses under Section 280E of the Internal Revenue Code, which prohibits businesses dealing in controlled substances from deducting ordinary business expenses. Ordinary businesses may deduct rent, salary, utilities, and operating costs. Cannabis businesses cannot. They may only deduct the cost of goods sold. This translates to effective tax rates as high as 70% or more. This crushing tax burden renders profitability nearly impossible for many operators. This contradiction is utterly absurd. States are collecting billions in cannabis taxes. Colorado alone has levied over $2 billion since legalization. Yet the federal government simultaneously punishes these businesses through predatory taxation and denial of banking services. The second issue is fairness, or rather, the absence thereof. The vast majority profiting from the legal cannabis industry are white, whilst incarceration for cannabis offenses disproportionately affects black and brown communities. This irony is both bitter and predictable. The war on drugs devastated minority communities. Now these same communities are excluded from the legal industry, an industry built upon their suffering. Access to the legal cannabis market is extremely high minus barrier. Licenses are limited in number and prohibitively expensive. Application fees alone can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. With no guarantee of approval, compliance costs are staggering. Security systems, testing requirements, packaging and labeling standards, inventory tracking software. Launching a legal cannabis enterprise requires millions in capital investment. But where does the funding come from? Banks refuse to engage with the industry. Traditional investors are largely deterred by its continued federal illegality. You require private wealth, connections or access to venture capital. Yet these very resources are typically absent in communities devastated by the war on drugs. Some states have attempted to address this through social equity programs, offering priority licensing or reduced fees to applicants from communities disproportionately affected by cannabis prohibition. However, these schemes are fraught with problems: funding gaps, bureaucratic delays, capital acquisition difficulties. Even after obtaining licenses, fraudulent practices emerge in certain cases. Affluent applicants exploit minority partners as funds to secure social equity eligibility, subsequently buying them out. Meanwhile, the criminal justice system continues operating under outdated rules. In states where cannabis is legal, thousands remain incarcerated for acts no longer considered crimes. Some states implement automatic expungement of cannabis convictions. The process remains often slow, incomplete, or requires navigating complex legal systems to clear records. Many convicted decades ago remain unaware of their eligibility for relief. In states where cannabis remains illegal, primarily in the South and Inland West, arrests persist. During the height of the 2020 pandemic, over 350,000 Americans were arrested on cannabis-related charges, equivalent to one arrest every 90 seconds, with the vast majority involving simple possession. For millions of Americans, the war on drugs is not history, but an ongoing reality. The third issue concerns public health, particularly among adolescents. Proponents of cannabis legalization have promised that regulatory frameworks would more effectively prevent minors from accessing cannabis than prohibition. Yet the evidence remains divided. Some studies indicate no rise in youth usage post-minors legalization, while others show modest increases. Yet the explosive potency of modern cannabis remains an indisputable fact. In the 1970s, cannabis averaged just a 3% tetrahydrocannabinol THC content. Today, levels have soared to 25–30%. Powdered cannabis with 25–30% THC is now commonplace. Concentrates, oils, waxes, and crumbles can exceed 90% THC content. This is not the cannabis of your grandparents' era, but an entirely different product, whose health impacts remain under investigation. Growing evidence suggests a link between high-potency cannabis use and mental health issues, particularly among adolescents and young adults. Long-term use of high-THC products has been shown to increase psychotic episodes in susceptible individuals and trigger cannabis-induced nausea and vomiting syndrome, a condition characterized by severe, recurrent vomiting. Heavy users may develop dependence, though not involving the physical withdrawal symptoms associated with opioid addiction. It can lead to psychological dependence that disrupts daily functioning. Industry marketing strategies further fuel this trend. Step into a modern cannabis dispensary. One encounters visually appealing products such as candy, cookies, gummy bears, chocolate bars, all containing high doses of tetrahydrocannabinol. Packaging design often deliberately targets younger consumers. Edible products present particular challenges due to delayed and unpredictable effects. Inexperienced users may consume an entire cookie with no reaction, only to ingest a second, resulting in an intense hallucinogenic state lasting up to 8 hours. In legalized regions, emergency room visits related to cannabis continue to rise, with overconsumption of edibles and accidental ingestion of candy like THC products by children being the most prominent issue. These problems could be addressed through improved packaging, clear dosage instructions, and enhanced public education. Yet the industry has been slow to respond, prioritizing profit over public health. The fourth issue concerns industry consolidation and corporatization. Many advocates envision legalization, fostering a cottage industry of small-scale growers and artisanal producers, cultivating a cannabis culture prioritizing quality and craftsmanship. Yet reality increasingly veers towards corporate oligopoly. Large-scale, multi-state operators such as Relief, Green Thumb Industries are acquiring licenses, constructing vast cultivation facilities, and squeezing smaller operators out of the market through price and scale. Vertical integration models, where a single enterprise controls the entire chain, from cultivation to processing and retail, is becoming the industry norm. These giants are racing to seize market dominance before federal legalization, aiming to become the new Budweiser or Philip Morris International of cannabis. When federal legalization inevitably arrives, most analysts believe it is merely a matter of time. These large enterprises will leverage their substantial capital, specialist legal teams, lobbying power and political connections to shape regulations favorable to their interests. The small farmers of Henel County, who have devoted decades to preserving cannabis culture, will ultimately be crushed by industrial agriculture. Should the artisanal cannabis movement survive, it will be relegated a niche, boutique status. This is the harsh reality behind legalization. It is neither a victory for counterculture, nor a triumph of justice, but rather the process of thoroughly commodifying and corporatizing what was once a symbol of resistance. This plant is being domesticated, stripped of its revolutionary symbolism, reduced to a common consumer item, like beer or cigarettes. Yet despite its many flaws, legalization remains preferable to prohibition, for prohibition is not merely a failure, it is an atrocity. Let us see the true outcome of this cannabis war. It has not reduced usage, it has not safeguarded public health, it has not enhanced community safety. What it has done is destroy lives on an industrial scale. It has filled our prisons to bursting point. The United States, with just 4% of the world's population, holds 20% of the world's prisoners, whether measured in absolute numbers or per capita. We incarcerate more people than any nation in history, and drug offenses are the primary driver of this mass incarceration. Drug offenses, led by cannabis, have cost taxpayers trillions of dollars. The direct costs of cannabis enforcement alone, arrests, prosecutions, and incarceration, exceed $3.6 billion annually. This excludes indirect costs, including lost productivity from incarcerated individuals, tax revenue forgone, foster care expenses for children of imprisoned parents, and long-term economic impacts on communities. The true cost is incalculable. Prohibition enriches criminal organizations by maintaining cannabis legality. All profits flow into the black market. Before state legalization began, Mexican drug cartels earned billions from cannabis. These profits funded cocaine and heroin trafficking, purchased weapons, and bribed officials. Prohibition is the drug cartel's greatest accomplice. It also distorts the law enforcement system. Driven by federal funding and asset forfeiture laws, police seize and retain property linked to drug offenses, shifting focus towards low-effort cannabis arrests rather than serious crime. This distorted incentive structure drives officers to boost arrests, statistics, and departmental budgets by intercepting black youths on the streets rather than investigating burglaries or assaults. The war on drugs further violates fundamental human rights. It serves as justification for conducting no-knock raids. It results in the deaths of innocent individuals. It is used to defend the militarization of police forces. It is employed to justify searches and seizures that violate the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. It grants the state immense power to intrude upon private lives, to kick down doors, to tear families apart, all under the pretext of preventing people from possessing a particular plant. And most egregiously, this war is built upon lies. The claim that cannabis incites violence is a pure fabrication. The notion that cannabis is a gateway to hard drugs is a lie lacking causal evidence. The assertion that cannabis has no medical value is a lie. The claim that drug prohibition is about public health is the most appalling lie of all. Harry Anslinger knew it well. Richard Nixon knew it well. Every administration since has known it well. This war on drugs was never about drugs. It was about power, control, suppressing dissent and targeting minority communities. In this sense, it succeeded. It achieved its true objective. It dismantled the anti-war movement. It devastated Black and Latino communities. It created a permanent underclass. Those burdened with criminal records are disenfranchised, deprived of employment rights, housing rights and opportunities for advancement, perpetuating the social hierarchy those in power wish to maintain. But lies cannot endure forever. Too many have consumed cannabis to discover it is not the mythical devil's drug. Too many have witnessed friends, relatives, children, neighbors arrested for seemingly harmless acts. Too many have seen through the hypocrisy of cannabis prohibition. Alcohol and tobacco, which claim hundreds of thousands of lives annually, are not only legal, but held in reverence. Truth will prevail through prolonged suffering. The current landscape is fractured, riddled with contradictions, yet rapidly evolving. In certain regions of the United States, one may enter gleaming dispensaries, browse hundreds of products, consult cannabis advisors on strains and effects, and legally purchase cannabis with a credit card. Yet in other areas, possession of the same plant still risks arrest, prosecution and imprisonment. Internationally, the wave of legalization accelerates. Uruguay legalized in 2013. Canada followed in 2018. Mexico's Supreme Court ruled prohibitions unconstitutional, though its legislature has yet to establish a regulatory framework. Germany is advancing towards legalization. Thailand decriminalized it in 2022. As billions in tax revenues flow to pioneers, even conservative jurisdictions are evaluating policies. The United Nations, an institution that for decades supported global prohibition through treaties like the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, has begun softening its stance. 2020 the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs votes to remove cannabis from the strictest control category, recognizing its medical value. The momentum for change is evident. Within a single generation, cannabis prohibition will likely be viewed much as we regard prohibition, as a disastrous policy fatally driven by moral panic and flawed science. A dark chapter in the history of social control. Yet the poisonous legacy of prohibition will endure for generations. Criminal records for millions, communities shattered by mass incarceration, trust destroyed between law enforcement and minority communities, lives ruined, families broken, potential squandered. These harms cannot be undone by legalization alone. True justice demands not only legalization, but reparations. This means expunging all cannabis convictions, releasing prisoners still serving sentences for cannabis offenses. It means compensating people for the years lost to incarceration. It means investing in communities targeted by prohibition, rebuilding what was destroyed. It means dismantling the architecture of the war on drugs, militicides policing, asset forfeiture laws, mandatory minimum sentences. Some of these reforms are slowly advancing, but they are far from complete. Others remain entirely stagnant. The cannabis industry is rising from the ruins of the war on drugs. Yet those profiting from legalization are seldom the victims of prohibition. This injustice lies at the heart of the legalization movement's contradiction. With every dispensary opening, every share price rising, every white entrepreneur becoming a millionaire by selling the same plant, the very plant that has sent black men to spend decades in prison, this unpaid moral debt grows heavier by the day. So what is cannabis truly? When we strip away a century of propaganda, decades of prohibition and the fog of contemporary commercial marketing, it remains, ultimately, a plant, an extraordinary crop whose connection to humanity stretches back to the earliest agricultural civilizations. It has nourished us, adorned us, healed us, altered our consciousness, ignited our creativity. It is both sacred and profane, medicine and poison, rope and rebellion. It is by no means harmless. Any psychoactive substance carries the potential for abuse. It may exacerbate mental health issues in susceptible individuals. It can impair judgment and coordination. Adolescents whose brains are still developing should particularly avoid it. Its effects are especially pronounced in this age group. Cannabis should be regulated and controlled. Its use should be grounded in scientific evidence, not marketing hype. Yet it is not the demonized monster the world portrays. It does not incite violence, nor is it an inevitable gateway to harder drugs. For many, it alleviates pain, anxiety, insomnia, and severe side effects. For others, it serves merely as a mild intoxicant, offering relaxation akin to sipping a glass of wine. The essence of cannabis issues has never resided in the plant itself. The crux lies in who uses it, who controls it, and who profits from it. When the Navy favored it for making ropes, yet when Mexicans smoked it, it became demonized. The plant that filled pharmacies in 1900 was criminalized when black jazz musicians embraced it. The plant that once sent people to prison for decades now enriches investors. This is not about pharmacology, but a struggle for power. The story of cannabis is ultimately a narrative of how society defines what is permitted and what is forbidden. These boundaries are not drawn by evidence or reason, but by fear, prejudice, and political expediency. This is testimony to how prohibition weapon is aired against the vulnerable. This is proof of how moral panic overrides science and common sense. And this will ultimately demonstrate that when enough people rise up in defiance, when enough voices expose the truth, even entrenched injustice will crumble. Yet the journey is far from over. To this day, prisoners remain behind bars. Arrests occur daily. The scars of prohibition still ripple through communities. Opponents of legalization and those profiting from prohibition continue to spread falsehoods. The truth about cannabis, that complex, subtle, evidence-based truth, still struggles to be heard amidst the clamor of propaganda and marketing. A plant once demonized is being purified, transforming into a consumer product stripped of its historical and political context. Companies entering the cannabis sector seek customers, not activists. They wish to peddle a lifestyle, not remind you of the millions suffering under prohibition. They want you to view cannabis as an ordinary commodity, like craft beer or artisan chocolate, to be consumed without thought. But we must not forget, we cannot allow cannabis legalization to erase the cost of prohibition, the memory of those harmed and the true reasons behind the prohibition. We cannot allow the profits of legalization to ignore their debt to those criminals for doing what is now lawful. This plant will grow. It always has. Through prohibition and persecution. Through propaganda and prejudice. Through a century-long war, cannabis persisted. It grew in hidden valleys and vast warehouses, in backyard gardens and pharmaceutical labs. It adapted. It evolved. It spreads. Yet the question remains, can our society learn from history? Can we acknowledge the harm wrought in the name of prohibition? Can we establish a truly just legal framework, centered on equity and reparation, rather than mere profit-seeking? Can we resist corporate control over a plant that belongs to all humanity? Or shall we choose to forget the past, and repeat the cycle of control and exploitation in new guises? The sun sinks below the horizon. The Andes soar into the clouds. 10,000 years ago, it was here that cannabis seeds first took root, initiating a millennia-spanning transcontinental relationship. Today, this plant still thrives here, spreading far and wide. Amidst Morocco's mountains, farmers cultivate cannabis resin following ancestral traditions across Kentucky's fields. Industrial hemp is experiencing a renaissance in Colorado suburbs. It grows legally under basement LED lights in Mexican jungles. Cartels still cultivate it by the ton, for not all regions have legalized it, and the black market remains rampant. The plant never judges. It bears no burden of propaganda, nor carries the shackles of history. It simply grows, bearing flowers, seeds, and resin. Then, like all living things, it withers, to be replaced by a new generation. But we bear a heavy burden. We bear the historical crimes committed in the name of controlling this plant. Millions arrested, billions squandered, countless lies propagated, countless lives destroyed, countless communities shattered. This history is not an abstract concept. It lives in those still imprisoned, in communities still recovering from the drug war, in families torn apart by the consequences of conviction. We also bear responsibility for the future, how we regulate, how we distribute profits and opportunities, whether we pursue justice rather than commerce, whether we remember history or forget it. The story of cannabis is not yet finished. We are living its new chapter. With every new law passed, with every dispensary opening, with every prisoner released or kept incarcerated, history is being written in real time. The ending remains undecided. Depending on the choices made in this moment, will we choose justice or convenience, healing wounds or profiting from them? Will we remember the cost, or allow cannabis legalization to erase the memories of prohibition's victims? These are not rhetorical questions. They are urgent, real-world moral imperatives, demanding our immediate response, not in some abstract future, but in this very moment, as we navigate this historic transition from prohibition to legalization. Regardless, this plant shall endure, having weathered millennia of human civilization. It shall transcend any future upheaval. The question is not whether cannabis will persist, but what we ourselves shall become. What kind of society do we aspire to be? Can we confront history with honesty, acknowledge our failings and build a better future? Have we learned from this century-long tyranny, cloaked in policy? Or are we merely shifting to the next holy war, the next moral panic, the next pretext for oppressing the vulnerable? The plant remains merely a plant. This war has always been about humanity itself, even as headlines clamour, even as laws unwind, even as dispensaries proliferate, tax coffers swell, stock valuations soar. The war is far from over. It has merely entered a new phase. The battlefield has shifted from the streets to the courts, from prisons to state legislatures, from debates over legality to gains of who profits. This is not a story with a happy ending. There is no ultimate victory, no moment declare mission accomplished. The tale of cannabis is humanity's saga with desire, with control, with substances that alter consciousness, and the power structures that determine which alterations are permitted. This is the saga of a plant, once revered as sacred, then utilized as a practical commodity, later demonized, subsequently criminalized, then medicalized, and now commercialized. It was rope and creed both panacea, and plague both counterculture emblem and commercial symbol. This tale began in antiquity, and stretches into an unknown future, written in hemp fiber and prison records, etched in pharmaceutical lists under arrest statistics, circulating between ancient rituals and corporate boardrooms. This is a story of blood and profit, lies and liberation, suffering and resilience. This is the story of how an ordinary plant became the world's most wanted drug, and this contest is far from over. As I write this in late 2025, cannabis occupies a peculiar gray zone within American society, achieving its highest level of legal acceptance in a century. Yet in certain states, more people remain incarcerated for cannabis offenses than for all violent crimes combined. It has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry. While businesses remained denied basic banking services, it is recognized as a medicinal drug by most states. Yet the federal government still deems it devoid of any medical value. This contradiction cannot persist forever. A breakthrough is inevitable. Within the coming years, the federal government will almost certainly reclassify cannabis, opening doors for interstate trade, banking services, and normal commercial operations. This will be hailed as a victory, a milestone marking progress in the end of prohibition. Yet this is not the end. It is the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh page in cannabis's long history. The core question defining this new chapter is not whether cannabis is legal, but what kind of legal market we will build, and who will benefit from it. Will it be a market that prioritizes equity, supports communities harmed by prohibition, and paves the way for small operators and artisanal producers? Or will it be dominated by a handful of giant corporations, concentrating wealth in the hands of vested interests, while leaving others behind? Will we expunge the criminal records of all those convicted of cannabis offenses, not only in states where it is legalized, but across the entire nation? Will we release all prisoners incarcerated for offenses that are now decriminalizing? Will we compensate them for the years stolen from them? Will we reinvest the billions in tax revenue generated by legal cannabis back into the communities devastated by the war on drugs? Will we fund education, treatment, economic development and restorative work? Will we hold accountable those who designed and enforced drug policies? Figures like Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon, who deliberately pursued racist agendas under the guise of public health, for their responsibility. Will we confront the historical truth and its motivations, or merely wrap things up hastily, declare victory, and leave the outcome to the free market? This inevitably means capitalists win. Those without capital lose. These questions remain unresolved. The political will to address them remains weak. Established interest groups, corporations vying to monopolize the legal market, law enforcement agencies whose budgets depend on drug war funding, politicians who build their careers on tough anti-crime rhetoric. All these forces lack the motivation to drive genuine restorative justice. Therefore, the burden falls upon us, activists, advocates, voters, consumers. We have the power to support equitable enterprises, demand more robust policies, to those who refuse to forget the atrocities committed in the name of prohibition, to those who firmly believe legalization is not merely a new opportunity for profit. Whether we participate or not, this plant will grow. It always has. But justice will not sprout on its own. It requires cultivation, nurturing, and struggle. The story of cannabis is not yet concluded. This moment we are writing it, and the length of the next chapter depends entirely on whether we have the courage to confront history, the wisdom to learn from our failures, the resolve to forge a better future. The plant is merely a plant. The true question remains, what kind of people will we choose to be?